Hello. So I am live for the first time using YouTube. Someone recommended this to me, one of my followers, and I'm giving it a shot. And I thought it might be a cool way to have a conversation if anyone finds this. Um, to have a conversation about reincarnation. So I published today a video I actually did yesterday on reincarnation and astrology. This one is the beginning of a longer conversation, I hope not too long, on reincarnation itself, my thoughts about it at least. And I, again, just want to say that I'm sharing my thoughts on reincarnation, not the way it is or the way, um, no dogma, And I think one of the things I'm challenging, because sometimes I get pushback when I talk about this online, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook, I get pushback specifically about, well, basically that's your opinion. Yeah, it is my opinion. But what's not recognized is that you can have another opinion other than what I talked about in my first video, where it's been found, according to a survey from the Astrological News Service, that out of 500 astrologers, 68% of them, nearly 7 out of 10, believe in reincarnation. I'm one of that 12% who do not. So I want to talk a little bit about why. Last time I talked about astrology and reincarnation and more its modern history. It's not something that runs throughout the gamut of Western astrology. I do know that it is something that is a common belief and basis of belief in Vedic astrology, or also known as Jyotish from India. And that makes sense because of many waves of thought in India related to reincarnation. So, why don't I believe in reincarnation? Well, I'll give you a little backstory and then I'll get into some my key thoughts. The backstory is when I converted to Islam in 2011. Bear with me before you go to that certain place where some people might go, because like, oh, you're Muslim. I knew it. That's why you believe like your soul goes to Jannah or Jahannam. That's why. No, none of that is what happened or happening for me. When I converted to Islam in 2011, it I gave myself a year of a suspension of disbelief in anything I was learning related to Islam. That doesn't mean I believed everything. I also decided not to disbelieve it. So I learned about Jannah, and that one soul doesn't immediately go to paradise. Actually, you're in your grave until Judgment Day, um, until you're called forward, and according to Islamic theology, and then it's decided where you shall go. That's actually true in Christian thought, but I think that's been lost in much of our thinking. The idea is that when you die, you go to be with the Lord, and then or you go to hell. I think there's strong aspects of Christian theology, and I say that because Christian theology is so diverse, where it's very clear that you actually may be in your grave until Judgment Day. So that's also a common thing, and maybe that's something that runs through the gamut of Abrahamic traditions. Anyway, with that suspension of disbelief in Islam, um, it got me thinking about things I did believe. And one of those things that I kind of loosely believed at that time was in reincarnation. And I was like, well, do I really believe in reincarnation? And I found in evaluating my own process that and thought processes, I did not. So why? Well, I'll start off with a question. What in nature is like reincarnation? What can we have as natural proofs? I'm not going to get into, what the Vedas say or the myth of from Plato thought, Platonic thought, or any other kinds of um, other thoughts, or I'm going to start with what we can see. So, what in nature is like reincarnation? And the common argument is that, well, everything, as I even heard recently from someone on Facebook, everything in nature is like reincarnation. Everything recycles, like we have seasons, and um, we have leaves on a tree that blossom again, or we have buds that blossom again from flowers from year to year. Here's the problem: nothing buds exactly in the same place or in the exact same way. So when we talk about reincarnation as being parallel to what we see in nature, it begs a question: what what has exactly transpired? Is it that we just have the resuscitation of a new cycle of life, let's say with a tree? Because even with a tree, a particular leaf doesn't bud in the exact same place from year to year. It's at a different part of the branch, a different part of the tree. And that becomes important because it really brings up, especially when you talk about parallels between what we talk about in reincarnation of the soul and what we talk about in terms of what happens in nature, it brings up a very profound point. And the point I would make is nature is always creating itself. And I think when I talk about it creating itself, whether that's manifest into the molecule of a cell of a tree, right? Or particularly of a leaf, what we're really taking away from that is that there are dimensions of life that kind of permeate all the different spectra of how life manifests, from again on the cellular level to we can go into the broader organism level like of a leaf, to the broader organism level of a tree, to an ecosystem or to a forest. And in nature manifesting itself, I'm more inclined to believe, as versus this idea of reincarnation, that each individual soul is a manifestation of natural life or nature, as we kind of put it, in some kind of cumulative agency definition, like nature, environment, God. Um, and when we talk about it that way, we then, of course, go to the question of the soul. Well, Sam, don't you believe you have a soul? I believe that more so that I am, you know, the spirit of nature as flesh in a body, that by virtue of that dynamic, we are creating soul. Soul is a process, soul is an aspect of embodiment, of maturating of soul or maturating of spirit in form. So I'm more inclined to think, rather than that my soul transmigrates and moves into different bodies, it's more so that nature is so infinite and vast and productive. I mean, so fertile and fecund that it reproduces as it needs rather than what I need. And that brings up a very important question. So, what about this whole idea that the soul is on a journey toward learning and toward learning more about itself, and as I said, I mean, I don't have to think about myself as an individual soul or having a soul that kind of moves on. What about that idea? I do think that has merit if we're going to talk about what happens in the hereafter, in the beyond. And the way in which I see it is that nature is always learning about itself through all the multiplicity of its forms at every level. So again, the question becomes, when we talk about reincarnation, what exactly are we talking about reincarnating? Because we talk about our soul, right? But why doesn't my soul, I mean, my cells, for instance, like my nail cells, do they reincarnate in the same way? Because what science has found is that, in terms of cells, even though we have like the basis as a common DNA, they're not all the same. There are ways in which we can identify particular markers or even particular kinds of cells. So even on the cellular level, there's a regeneration, of course, but is that the same as reincarnation? And why is reincarnation peculiar only to the dimensions of souls? And what souls do, in fact, reincarnate? Um, does my cats, my dogs, and people do make that argument, of course, that they do. But it's just as likely and easy to believe that these various creatures at various different levels are not so much reincarnations of other souls or other creatures as much as testimony to how much life, nature is so productive, so fecund, and kind of constantly creating forms. Now, someone did mention to me recently, and I'll wrap this particular part up shortly, so that we'll do yet another video. And I don't think anyone has chimed in on this live because I don't think anyone knows that I'm doing it live. But someone said, well, Sam, isn't it much more expedient and efficient for nature to kind of reuse particular souls again rather than kind of keep creating souls. Well, that's imagine first if you imagine that we all have distinct souls, right? Rather than life being life, consciousness being consciousness in form. And that's what actually ultimately learns. This is something the Sufis talk about. This is something that is also in another strain or several strains of Hindu thought. So this is common as no division in something called Advaita Vedanta. Um, so it's not something that's isolated from all the ways in which we kind of call and have this concept of reincarnation. And one thing is that in terms of this one life, this one consciousness kind of permeating all of us, all things alive, that is what's constantly learning, constantly growing, and all the multiplicity of forms that have ever existed, that continue to exist. So when we talk about reincarnation, it almost seems less efficient to say, like, well, I'm going to take this soul and keep learning along its particular trajectory until like it understands and has better consciousness, better form. I see one person has joined us. I have no idea who that is, but yo, hello. Um, so the idea of taking one soul and carrying it along and having it mature and have it grow in a particular way, you just as easily have a different form, a different shape to it. The same thing, like, well, I don't have to worry about when I take some plastic bottle and put it in a recycling plant that like that bottle is going to be extant as itself. It becomes part of other things, and I think that's what also happens whether we talk about this composite in terms of the body. Like that's literally true. Like when, as far as we understand it scientifically, you biodegrade and then parts of you become parts of other things. Why couldn't this happen also on the soul level, quote unquote? Because consciousness doesn't have to divide itself, and I think that's a very important aspect of looking at what we see in nature, what we perceive, rather than thinking that when we talk about reincarnation, it has to be this atomistic individual sense of oneself. And I think that comes from needing to vouch for our egos, needing to know that you are so unique and so without precedent that we have to persist after we have shed this mortal coil. And that brings up a lot of interesting issues. I mean, I'm not saying that that's not true. Um, I don't believe that, but when I say that that's not true, it's more so reminding you we don't ultimately know. But why I'm suspicious of that concept is that on some level, and this is what I may talk about next time, I think that would be cruel. Um, and I'll get to that. It'd be cruel to kind of keep shepherding one single soul through all these different permutations, even though it may not completely remember all its previous lives or dimensions of itself. So, why don't I leave that for next time? For this one person tuning in, I want to thank you for doing that. And I don't even know if when you do live stream it records. I hope so, but I'm about to see, and maybe I'll have to do it all over.